All right, so I'm trying a new setup here. We'll see if the audio visual is a improvement over the stuff I've been using in the past. And I thought today might be useful to do, well, I guess what I would call Sensemaking 101. As far as I'm concerned, the 3 points or principles or concepts that I'm going to go over right now are pretty basic, but it's always good to go over the basics. So the context here is sense making, and in particular, sense making vis-a-vis journalism. So, 3 ideas. The first idea is Gell-Mann amnesia. This is named after Murray Gell-Mann, and I think the best way to describe it is in the form of a narrative. And so, as I understand it, one day Murray, who, if you don't know, was one of the legendary physicists of the 20th century, so he knows physics well. And he was sitting leafing through a copy of the New York Times Sunday edition and reads an article about the theater, and wow, how interesting, and reads an article about anthropology, wow, how interesting. And then he turns the page and there happens to be an article about physics. And he's just shocked by how utterly wrong the article is. To the point where, to have read the article, he just imagined somebody else who's read the article would not just be ill-informed, but would in some sense even be misinformed, the exact opposite of what is true. And he knows this. He's an expert. He knows this space well. He's shocked and dismayed. And then he turns the page, and there's an article about economics. And he somehow magically forgets the lesson that he had just a moment ago, which is that sometimes, in fact, in cases where you happen to know what's really the case, you notice that journalism happens to be oftentimes radically wrong. But the moment you move out of a zone where you have personal expertise, you confer legitimacy and authority back to the journalists. You forget the lesson. You have amnesia. And this is a very powerful thing because, of course, most of the time when we're interacting with the world through journalism, we don't have expertise. And so if we intuitively, unconsciously confer legitimacy and authority to that journalism, but also in those rare moments where we do actually have expertise, we see that it is radically wrong, one might imagine we're making a big mistake. So the basic lesson of amnesia is remember those times where you have had unique, sometimes personal experience or expertise and have seen how poorly journalism actually tells the story of what is real, and then apply that same standard universally across all examples of journalism. Put the bias or put the burden of proof on the other side. Amnesia. Very powerful tool to start with because it gives you the ability to say, okay, it's very, very rarely the case that the surface content in any work of journalism is really close to the underlying truth that would be held by somebody who really understands the space well. Journalism is intrinsically distorted and oftentimes wildly distorted, no matter how well-intentioned the journalist happens to be. Okay, second point. The second is called, or I'll call it, cherry picking. And the key notion here, I think the most fundamental notion is to recognize that any act of journalism, in fact, any act of perception of complex reality, by necessity, has to be an act of cherry picking. Right? The complex reality is some very rich, nuanced, and subtle, overwhelmingly complex phenomenon. When you perceive it, you're selecting some subset of that whole to be what you perceive as being salient and or relevant. And then when you retell that in any form of medium, as you're now the journalist, whether I'm telling you a story now or you're reading an article, there is another act of selection of which points to bring into the foreground and which points to allow to sit in the background or even to be unspoken. So it is intrinsically a cherry picking exercise. Now, here's the challenge. Artful journalism actually does a skillful job at cherry picking. It creates, for example, it would be very poor journalism to convey facts that are not true. It's very skillful journalism to convey facts that are true but out of the complex whole, precisely convey the point that you want to make. Right? So it's about how do you bring into the foreground the aspects of the story that tell the story that you want to tell. How do you make the facts fit the story? And that's cherry picking as a fundamental exercise. So again, you cannot get away from cherry picking. It is always going to be a very low fidelity projection of the much richer, complex reality that it is a perception and expression of. The tricky business comes when you deal with very skillful journalists, and by the way, it's just sort of any skillful storyteller, who identifies what are in fact real true facts, real aspects of the underlying reality, but by picking the ones that are told, creates a perception of the underlying reality that is perhaps not, carries a bias to it. And this again may be unconscious or conscious. A large portion of what happens, of course, is unconscious. We've got our own intrinsic biases that bias our own perceptions. I see a particular reality. Again, I'm selecting some subset of that, and almost all of that is unconscious on my part, even at the level of physiology. At the level of physiology, I am not seeing the ultraviolet light that is reflecting off the event. Right? Even at that level, there is a selection. And then, of course, you've got the unconscious biases that are associated with my ego identity and with my interpretive frames, my paradigms, my ideologies that constrain the way that I make sense of what I'm seeing. You have the unconscious biases that are associated with the context, the aesthetics of the context. Right? So if I'm writing for the New York Times, there are stylistic biases in how articulation must happen for it to be considered a valid piece of prose in the New York Times that implicitly also carries certain aspects of what the story is going to be out, as compared to, say, for example, in the National Enquirer. Like the same underlying phenomenon, and let's just, for the moment, and good faith journalists expressing that same underlying phenomenon in those media. The media themselves, and both here print on paper, carry distinct differences in the perspective that will ultimately be conveyed through those channels. Right? And that all has to be realized. Like if you're going to be doing sense making, you have to be able to understand the reality of the channel and how the channel is going to be massively biasing the thing that it is conveying through to you, and at least be aware of it. Being able to reverse engineer it and try to reproject something closer to higher fidelity on the other side is doable, but also is challenging because you're going to have you are your own channel. So then the third, and now I think the point here is to try to move them in levels of generality. The third has to do with framing, or Russell conjugation is an art in the context of framing. So Russell conjugation is a term that is used to describe the fact that there are many different adjectives, I suppose also adverbs, but mostly adjectives, and even nouns that can be used to describe an underlying phenomenon. So, for example, I'm a reporter and I'm at a train wreck. Right? I could say, I'm here at the scene of a train wreck. Right? That's true. That is a true articulation. Or I could say, I'm here at the horrifying scene of the train wreck. Arguably also very true. But the choice of the difference brings a context. Right? It brings a frame. Another way of saying it is, to what degree is the article or the journalism telling you what is, and to what degree is it telling you how to feel about what is? And if you take the time to really carefully look at what is the feeling sense that is being conveyed, and you notice the degree to which it's uniform, right? Is there in fact a continuity of feeling sense in the selection of the adjectives and nouns used to describe the underlying event? Then you can pull that out and say, okay, well, this is a frame that is being imposed upon the underlying reality by the channel, in this case by the journalism or the journalist. And it's important for me as a sense maker to choose how I feel, separate from the Russell conjugation, separate from the frame that is being provided. And this, of course, happens, again, all the time. But artful journalists will tend to do a better job. So they will carefully select feeling language. They'll carefully select Russell conjugation that isn't objectionable, but is sort of a subtle shift. So it's actually could be your own biases, your own sort of predilections, or the likely frame that you're already carrying coming in meets a handshake and is supported and upregulated. That's an artful journalist. And a simple example is something like the difference between the Fox News framing and, I don't know, the MSNBC framing of an underlying event. Fox News has a pretty good idea of what the underlying frame is going to be of their audience, and MSNBC pretty well understands what the underlying frame is going to be of their audience. And so they have, either consciously or unconsciously, a pretty good idea of what is sort of the Overton window of Russell conjugation that they can provide to connect with and nudge that frame without bouncing off. Right? And so if you invert it, if you show a Fox News clip to an MSNBC viewer, then you have that kind of being bounced out of what's it called in film studies? My willful disbelief or willful belief. I can't remember which one it is. If I'm an MSNBC viewer and I'm watching MSNBC, I don't bounce. I stay in the narrative. I smoothly flow with the frame because they've done it. They're good at making sure that my frame and their frame are well connected, and they can kind of pull me along without me stepping out of, oh, I'm watching flickering photons on a screen that is maybe arguably a real face who maybe arguably is telling me something vaguely close to true. The feel you have when you're in a movie theater and you suddenly decide not to be watching the movie but actually be watching people watching the movie, that feeling. If you're the MSNBC viewer and you watch the Fox clip, you'll actually have that. You'll bounce out and be like, oh man, this is such obvious manipulation and propaganda. And vice versa. If you're a Fox viewer and you watch the MSNBC clip, the same thing happens. But kind of like Gell-Mann amnesia, if you are in the reality tunnel co-creation machine that most closely matches your own prior biases and frames, it's so easy to forget and to flow with that Russell conjugation. So it can be very useful is to just use Russell conjugation and feeling language as a primary sense-making protocol. Before you even consider the content, like literally scan the text and don't even don't try to make sense of the words and phrases in terms of what's the story being told. Literally just do like a grammatical exercise, like underline the adjectives and then notice, are the adjectives uniform in terms of the quality of feeling and the intensity of feeling? Bad is not as strong as terrifying. Right? Okay, well that tells me a lot. And it tells me what the underlying bias is of this particular channel. If I can see what is the sort of Gestalt Russell conjugation that is being used to provision the frame. And I can also, by the way, see the degree to which this particular channel implicitly or explicitly endeavors to tell me how to feel. Right? If it's up front in the very beginning, like if in the very first sentence there's very strong framing language, then I know that I'm in a feeling manipulation channel, and that's just going to create a huge amount of important work on my part to not be manipulated. And by the way, in many cases, to reverse engineer. Okay, if this is a feeling manipulation channel, they're actually mostly propaganda, whether they like it or not. And so I need to understand what is the actual propaganda that's being conveyed through this channel. And then you can oftentimes eke really interesting sense making out of that. One of the categories that I often use is what I call anti-signal, which is to say that oftentimes the deeper reality, or for me the deeper insight when I'm consuming a piece of journalism, is the almost the inverse of what's conveyed in the actual content. So you read something and it has a very strong and very early and very intense set of Russell conjugation, a very intense form of frame control. Well, okay, that tells me that perhaps what I should do is almost think about the exact inverse of that frame. Hold that, and what happens? What happens if I look at the same event through the exact inverse frame? Anti-signal. It's just something about that gives me a different perspective on the underlying event, and why might this particular channel, in some sense, want me to feel this way? Is there an underlying intent, or is there something happening where I can actually suss that out? And of course, almost all channels are part of some larger collection of a continuity of frames. So MSNBC has a bias. Fox News has a bias. And so I can say, okay, what is the larger construct of which Fox News is a part? And if I can see that they have an intense, early, almost grotesque Russell conjugation, if I flip it, look at it through the inverse, then I can try to see, okay, well, what are the interests or the intents that are furthered by my buying their version of the story? And the same thing on the other side. Right? Yeah, so I hope that this particular AV setup works, and the audio is good, and the video is good, and the lighting is good. And I also hope that this the content of a little bit of Sensemaking 101 is a nice refresher.